Okay, in section 2 of the investigations, Wittgenstein invents a shopkeeper. Okay, this is before the builder's example. Sorry, it's section 1, but it's after the Augustine quote. And he says this: think of the following use of language. I send someone shopping. I give him a slip of paper marked 5 red apples. He takes the slip to the shopkeeper, gives him the paper, who opens the drawer marked apples. Then he looks up the word red in a table, a colour chart, and he finds a colour sample opposite red. Green, red, blue, and then a little patch of colour, paint chart. Then he says the series of cardinal numbers. I assume that he knows them by heart, up to the word 5. And for each number, he takes an apple of the same colour as the sample out of the drawer. It's in this and similar ways that one operates with words. But how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red, and what he is to do with the word 5? Well, I assume that he acts as I've described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. But what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing was in question here, only how the word 5 is used. Can you understand the description? You understand the words? And it's a bit weird, isn't it? It's almost a little bit surreal. Because like the example of the builders, these people don't seem like normal people. So he's trying to understand how these most simple things that a 5-year-old child could do, how does that come to be? And of course the shopkeeper does not really go to a drawer, go to a colour chart to check what red means. Okay, so there's something quite artificial. You could make a computer work like that. I imagine a computer would be programmed to check the word red against a colour sample and then the appearance of the red apple. You can imagine a computer functioning like this man. So I think here Wittgenstein is not giving you an explanation. He's showing the strangeness of how we come to these concepts. How is it that we learn what 5 means? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but of course that's 5 as well. How do we come to learn that? What kinds of things do we do? Not just things we learn as propositions, but things that we do, how our behaviour is shaped. Right, following a rule, mistakes, correction and criteria. One of the things Wittgenstein is concerned with is really not just with words and their usage, but with our thought. And he asks, can there be a private rule? Because we saw that to use the word pencil appropriately, I needed to carry on having a pencil or giving you a pencil or doing things appropriately in that case. But now the question is, could there be a rule that was private in principle? Like a code that only I know, not one I can write down and then show you, but one that in principle I can only know. And he gives an example. Because the example is partly based on the notion that surely my thoughts are private. Sometimes I have thoughts I can't put into words. Surely they're private. And so he takes the example of something that seems the most private thing, pain. Surely my pain is something that I have and you can't know my pain. It's I that have direct contact with my pain. No one else knows my pains. So let's imagine, he says, that I have a particular kind of headache. And never mind the details, it's just a particular headache that I get quite frequently. And no one else seems to quite have this headache. I've got no evidence for anybody having the same headache. But when I get this particular pain, I make a note and I write down S for sensation in my diary. Oh, got it then. and then 2 hours later write it down again because the pain's come back. So every time I have an S, I write down S in my diary, the same pain again. But can I be mistaken when I identify an S? S, there it is again. How do I know it's the same? If I say pencil, you'll say, no, it's not a pencil, it's a pen, it's a marker pen. Okay? But with S, you can't really say that to me because you don't know what S was in the first place, because you don't have my pains. So, I taste a dressing, and I think it is ponzu. It's that kind of mix of sort of vinegar and soy, lemon taste. I could be mistaken, and someone who knows what it is tells me I am wrong, it's made of a different thing, it's not ponzu, although it's similar. Or perhaps I look at the bottle, as if I could read. Perhaps I look at the bottle and I see a different name from ponzu. Okay, so I thought it was ponzu. Oh, look, it's not. So similar. But what's happened there is that you correct me. I don't just mean because I'm not Japanese. You correct me. Or the bottle, the label, corrects me and I see it's not ponzu. But in the case of S, there was no you there because our starting point was that it was a private thought. Something that you can't know. But how can I verify then what seems to be an S? How can I check that that indeed is an S? Because I write down S one day, and then I think I've got the same pain the next day and write down S again. But how can I know it's the same one? Because I may not remember accurately and so on. So what this is leading to is the notion that the possibility of a mistake and correction of a mistake is part of what a rule is. For there to be rules, there must be the possibility of a mistake. For there to be mistakes, there must be a community that corrects me. Whereas in the S example, it was all private. You had no access to this thing that I think I feel. So the final comment on that screen then, what can count as being an S if there are no public criteria and shared practices in which these criteria are expressed? Incidentally, you can distribute the PowerPoint afterwards, so you can go over this later, but by all means make notes if you want. Can I give you an example now? Oh, gosh, I've got a splitting headache. I'll have some aspirins. I'm a bit dehydrated. What you've just seen is a lot of behaviour. I reach for the aspirins, I take some liquid, I hold my head. That's how I've learnt what headaches are. It's out of seeing that behaviour in other people, seeing they're unhappy, seeing they go in to lie down for a while, seeing they feel better later on. That's why I've learned what headaches are. So Wittgenstein will say that having a headache, having the pain, depends upon public criteria. And that looks really weird, doesn't it? Because surely it's a physiological disturbance that's the headache. He doesn't deny the physiological disturbance, but what we mean by headache is generated out of that public behaviour in relation to that stimulus. The public behaviour, the things we do and say, it's out of that shared articulation that my idea of a headache is generated. So he's taking the most extreme example, the thing that seems so private. Surely my pains are mine, you can't feel my pain. The most extreme private thing, and he's saying even that is generated out of this social experience where criteria are generated.
That is a sort of shared understanding of what Wittgenstein says, but the interpretation of what he says here diverge. For example, Stanley Cavell interprets this understanding as private, as something on border between what cannot be said and what can be said. Whereas Kripke's interpretation of Wittgenstein is more on the side of shared public, visible, shared criteria.
Yes, I don't think Cavell denies what I've said completely, but what he thinks is that the people who make the point that I've just made throw too much emphasis on what is conventional and shared, that public behaviour, to the neglect of some personal response to this.
Or something which cannot be fully expressed.
Yes, that's right. But I don't think I can have that personal response except out of this sharing of criteria. Okay? Of course, if I had never been in a human community, the wolves or bears had looked after me, then I would have grown up and I would have had thought of some kind, but it would be nothing like human thought. It would be animal thought, let's say, thought about survival and so on. So to be a human being, I'm introduced into this shared world, this social world, where criteria are articulated, and it's out of that that my responses come. But you're right, from Cavell's point of view, these are then personal, different, at odds with what others are saying, and so on. So of course I may have some strange headache that it's a headache that's just there, that point, and no one else seems to have that. But to have said that, I've got to have all the background of headache behaviour to get the very idea going.
So there's nothing like purely personal, private experience which only you can have.
Not qua human being. All right? So if I was brought up in the woods by bears, then I'd still have something or other, but it would be bear thought rather than human thought. So human being, the initiation into the language world is fundamental. Okay? So it's quite difficult that, but if you can grasp it, I think it's very central to what he's saying. Next slide, okay? So this seems to generate a kind of behaviorism, and I referred to B.F. Skinner earlier on, the American Harvard psychologist. It's not behaviorism in his sense. So Wittgenstein's version is there must be public criteria, shared criteria. There must be practices in which meaning is generated. So we've got our question, is Wittgenstein a behaviorist? You can say this if you like, provided that you don't mean anything like the reductivist kind of behaviorism that Skinner comes out with, where all there is behaviour. Skinner talks about the conditioning of behaviour. That's what learning amounts to. Nor is he a verificationist. Perhaps that word's come up before with us, I'm not sure. So a verificationist, someone like the A.J. Ayer, or perhaps the early Wittgenstein, or the Vienna Circle of philosophers, a verificationist claims that meaning is dependent upon there being a method of verification for any proposition. Otherwise, the proposition is nonsense. So they would say, if I say the bottle is on the table, then we have a test for that because we all look and we share the judgment that the bottle's on the table, so yes, it's true. If I say it's a beautiful day today, then we haven't got clear criteria for what beauty is. We can say the sun is shining, we can check, but whether that's beautiful is something we cannot check. So on this crazy verificationist view, statements like it's a beautiful day today, or you're a very conscientious student, they have no verification, so they are nonsense. Very extreme view, developed in the 1920s and 30s. So this isn't Wittgenstein. I'm just trying to show you what he's not saying. Wittgenstein's notion is much looser. It depends upon there being practices in which for the most part, generally in other words, we know how to go on. Okay, so pain behaviour, aspirin's this. And when little children learn what headaches are, they often get it wrong. And they see adults doing this, so the child does this, and probably they're feeling nothing at all. But it's out of seeing what the adults do that they later associate the behaviour and the feelings and so on. So, an interesting idea is the idea of grammar. And two sentences from Wittgenstein. Essence, what things are really like, the reality of things, is expressed by grammar. And 2 paragraphs later, grammar tells us what kind of object anything is. Adding in brackets theology as grammar. Forget the brackets for the moment. Let's have a quick gloss on this. You was drunk. Shouldn't be you was drunk, it should be you were drunk, shouldn't it? Yes? We shouldn't say you was drunk, it should be you were drunk. Yes, you know the grammar, okay? So that's the conventional idea of grammar, the linguistic idea. Okay, the children was young. That's wrong because it should be children were young because the verb needs to be plural as well as the noun. Okay? So that's not what he's talking about. He's got something different in mind, and it's different in the following ways. Grammar derives from the coherence of a sentence with a language game. So if a child grew up thinking a pencil was something you just threw at people, then there would be something wrong with their understanding of sentences, of pencils. Okay? They wouldn't have got the practice of using a pencil, drawing, writing, and so on. They would have misunderstood. So to understand what a pencil depends upon a grammar of behaviour, a grammar within the language game. To understand what the cup is depends upon a grammar. And you know, if you have domestic dogs, they can interact very well with human beings, but they don't get the grammar of some things we have, like pencils and cups and so on. So grammar opens up a part of reality. We come back to what we said about holism earlier on. To understand the cup is to understand a social practice and coffee and sitting down together, having a break in the morning session and so on. That's part of the grammar of cup, drinking and so on. So the grammar of taking your shoes off when you go into a house in Japan. It's not an isolated atom of behaviour, it's something that has sense in relation to a complex set of notions, including intimacy, respect, cleanliness, and quite a strong notion of inside and outside. And that strong differentiation gives a feeling of hominess when you're in the house, which is stronger than if you live in a culture where people live outside much more, or where the boundary between inside and outside is not very clear because it's a very agreeable climate, you don't have to shut doors and so on. So the grammar of taking your shoes off generates a lot. If you hold on to that last idea, then the 373 becomes quite important, because the grammar of taking your shoes off tells you something about what home is like in Japan. And it's only a small step from there to understanding Buddhism, isn't it? Part of the understanding Buddhism, part of the grammar of Buddhism is that you take your shoes off when you go into the temple. Right? So what Wittgenstein will say is that Western people, especially Protestant Christians, are obsessed with questions about the truth of propositions. Does God exist? Right? Either that's true or it's false. Does the bottle exist? Yes, it does. So does God exist? It looks like the same kind of question. What Wittgenstein says is that we're misunderstanding the grammar of religious language and practices, and the reality of religion is within that grammar. Just as the reality of Buddhism, totally different religion, the reality of Buddhism is within the practice of taking shoes off, being silent for a certain time, clearing your mind, kneeling, observing a practice. So that last bit that I've said, it's very difficult for Western people to get that sometimes. That's why he says this extraordinary thing, theology as grammar. Okay? Right, Cavell's reading of the turning of the spade. Let me come back to that maybe in a minute. The supposed threat of relativism, if it's all based on criteria, and criteria are culturally generated, it looks as though this is relativistic. And he says at one point, and this is someone questioning him as it were, you are saying that human agreement decides what's true and what's false, as though people sit around and discuss what is true and false. And he says, it is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language they use. This is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. So, how is it we have this agreement over what a headache is, or what an appropriate argument is, what's meaningful and what is not? It's not like having an agreement that Barack Obama is on balance a better president than George Bush was. We could argue about that and come to a conclusion. So it's not like that kind of agreement that's the result of argument. It's to do with, for example, the fact that we find the temperature in this room reasonably comfortable. If we were polar bears, it would be far too hot. If we were lions, it would be too cold. But human beings share similar reactions to things. What they can eat, what they can't eat. Temperatures, what we can reach, where we see and how we see. So almost at this physiological level, we agree in our reactions to things. And that is the basis of this shared living together. It's not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. Now, if language is to be a means of communication, he says, there must be agreement not only in definitions, but also, queer as it may sound, strange as it may sound, agreement in judgments. So our judgment is about this room's reasonably comfortable in temperature. That's the agreement he means, not our judgment that Hillary would have been a better president or not, or Bernie Sanders. So, we talked about lions, and he says, really sort of aphoristic, puzzling sentence, if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. And although a lion's physiology is a bit like ours, I mean they eat, sleep, reproduce, and die, a bit like us in many ways, the judgments they have about the world are quite different, because this is far too cold for them, and the food we eat is stuff they can't digest. They need raw meat and so on. And so that physiological difference means that their world is already going to be so different from ours. Just before we do that one. So lions eat, sleep, reproduce, die. Their form of life is the same wherever there are lions. Doesn't matter which country it's in, it's always going to be the same practice. I know they may have to adapt a bit if human beings are in the way, or if the temperature changes, but basically it's the same behaviour. And I imagine the noises they make are quite the same. Human beings eat, sleep, reproduce, die. Their form of life is such that these elements, eating, sleeping, reproducing, dying, are realised in different ways, in different places, and at different times. So at one time, they eat by holding a fork in the left hand. Somewhere else, they hold it in the right hand. The marriage ceremony is different in different countries. How people are dealt with when they're dead is different. Food is different. So we've got the same practices, but cultural variations. So the form of life is always cultural and not just natural or social. There's a natural side to us, as there is to lions. Lions are social creatures as well. They live with others, and that's important to them. But the cultural is where meaning comes into this at a quite different level, a self-conscious level, and where cultural variation is generated, and of course language variation. So meaning and identity, this cultural differentiation is realized not just in different languages, but in language games, like having a cup on a table, not just taking the liquid in your hands from the spring of water and drinking like this, but having a cup on the table. Having a coffee because it's partly nice and it's partly a social thing to do, and so on. And these language games are in the following sense non-natural. The animal's life, the lion's life is natural, but ours are only partly natural. Human signs, which of course depend upon rules and criteria. By signs I mean words, but also high five or stop or whatever this might mean. They're unlike animal signs in that they're necessarily open to new possibilities. They involve the projection of possibility. We saw that in relation to 2468, John Coltrane and so on. They're open to new possibilities. And they involve a relation to what is not immediate. So in order to say bottle appropriately about this thing here, I must also be able to recognize the bottles in the bars around here, or a gas bottle in a hospital, for example. And I can use the word metaphorically. I don't know if you can say this in American English. If you say someone's got bottle, does that mean anything? It means they've got courage or strength. You know, they're prepared to stand up for themselves and fight. So I can use things metaphorically as well. So it relates not just to this thing, but something that's not here as well, this non-immediacy. And I can refer to it, I can refer to things that are not in the room. Human beings and their institutions are performatively constructed, as we said earlier on, okay, through language games. And hence their identity is not an essence, not some fixed thing, but it's fluid and under construction in processes that cause anxiety. As to whether we're using the words correctly, whether we're making sense in our argument, whether we can make others understand us, or whether we're frustrated and turn away, whether we belong to a group because we're holding our fork or our chopsticks the right way or not, whether we know how to play a game, whether we're doing philosophy in an appropriate way. Okay, shall I stop? Yes. Do you want to talk in Japanese for a bit?
No, you don't have to talk in Japanese, but I think you talk many things is very important, but I think I need time to make connections. So you say at the end, in this, the very nature of human beings as linguistic being in itself carries this instability by nature, which creates the sense of anxiety. That is the point of these slides. But a couple, in slides with a while ago, you said something like bedrock and foundation. Could you talk a bit about that?
Okay. Well, so some people in relation to Wittgenstein would say that he's saying that ultimately the community has authority and that the learner must come into the social world by adopting the ways of reasoning and thinking that the community passes on. Well, that's a very conservative way of understanding what Wittgenstein is saying. I don't think we should just be concerned about Wittgenstein. I think this is of much more general significance. The other way to understand Wittgenstein would say that we must be exposed to this circulation of signs, this way that other people are going on, and we must follow on in the way they're doing things, otherwise we will never connect with others, connect with the society. So in order to speak, I must learn what a pencil is and how to use the word pencil. But learning what a word is, how it's used, being initiated into a practice is not something that's just fixed. It's something that also has possibilities for new development and growth. Therefore, the boundaries within which I'm working are fluid ones which I can extend and move on. So what democracy is, I come into a society which is democratic, but what democracy is not finally determined. It's always open to some further possibility of thought and argument in which I might challenge some of the accepted notions and push for some further development.
What was interesting for me was that following rules or can be itself involves changing or transition fluid nature, which on the one hand can be understood in terms of rhythm and repetition, and is that for example, in music, experience music is evokes upsurge of energy or fun or happy feeling. But on the other hand, that the same repetition or the fluidness makes the feeling of anxiety or instability. Do you have any idea about the sorry, very vague question, but the dynamics between this upsurge and anxieties? Can I say this positive and negative?
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you think of adolescent people, 13-year-olds, say, then often they're very anxious to be included, so they dress the same, and that's okay, but then they say the same things because they're frightened of saying anything different. So that prevents them from developing their own voice, and it prevents them from saying anything interesting as well. It's very predictable what they will say. They're kind of hiding from the possibilities of new thought and new experience. So there you see the kind of thing that people face generally. It's true of us too, that we sometimes settle for a received point of view rather than risking saying something new. And then if someone risks too much and says things that the community doesn't understand, then sometimes they isolate themselves from the community. So that's a danger as well. So if I think I have my own philosophical thoughts, and you don't understand me, but I've got my thoughts, I go to another group, they don't understand me either, but I have my own thoughts, then eventually I become an isolate, and probably I'm a bit crazy. So there's a tension, isn't there, between doing something which seems just right for me, where perhaps the others don't understand, and the need to make others understand. And if I never articulate my thoughts, if I never try to connect, then the dangers of going a bit crazy are worse. That seems to me very important for education. On the whole, young people in schools and universities today are encouraged more to follow prescribed answers, to find prescribed answers, I think. Very often now in examinations, there is a list of the points that the student should cover, and that closes down thought rather than opening it up. I think the essay you do is far better because there isn't a strict idea of what you should do or what you shouldn't do, so you have more scope. But on the whole, the tendency has been towards specified learning outcomes, and that closes down thought. In a climate of anxiety where if we don't compete well with others, or our school doesn't compete well, then we'll be in problems.
In one of the slides you talk about the title of your slides is relativism.
Yeah.
And I think that if meaning depends upon cultural variation, it always creates the possibility of relativism with regard to the notion of authority. And I know that you give a sort of well-balanced interpretation of Wittgenstein, but I think that there is always the possibility of this notion of language in itself falls into the camp of relativism.
Well, I mean, Wittgenstein came into philosophy through engineering originally. He was not an outstanding school student, and he trained to be an engineer. And then he came to to Manchester in England, and worked in the development of propellers for aeroplanes, and the technology, the mathematics of their design. Then he got interested in mathematics much more, and the philosophy of mathematics, and he became interested in what Bertrand Russell was doing. So that was his lead into this. So he's someone who's very interested in mathematics and science. What he would say is that science is a language that we've developed, a language for dealing with the world. And of course it deals with the real world. It deals with the river and the riverbed and the movement of sand. But the ideas we develop depend upon ways of reasoning in shared practices of argument which change over time. He's not saying these are purely cultural. They connect with aspects of the physical world, for example, which are intractable. But our ways of dealing with them, our ways of articulating this, depend upon cultural constructions. Sometimes those cultural constructions are ones that are not locally dependent. So physics in the present day world is the same in Bolivia and in Japan and in New Zealand and in Moscow and so on. So some of these ways of reasoning are very, very powerful. But he has a nice metaphor here. He says that language is a bit like an old town. When you go to an old town, to begin with, you don't know your way around. But then you notice a monument here, a post office, or a place you can get some food. You see the ways between these windy streets in the centre of the town. And then you discover on the outside of the town, there are factory estates, factories, okay? And maybe research laboratories as well. So things like physics as a subject of study is like a factory estate on the edge of town that arises out of this ordinary interaction we have with one another. And it's fantastically powerful as a language. It's a language that is a cultural product which has a power to draw in people from, it's valid for people around the world. So he's not relativistic in that way at all. Neither is it relativistic to say that, you know, human beings always need to reproduce, eat, sleep, and they die. Their particular ways of doing that are always culturally varied.
So it's neither fully anti-foundationalist or fully foundationalist.
I'd say it's more anti-foundationalist than non, because if you took as a paradigm of foundationalism having a rock and then building an idea up on the basis of this solid starting point, then I think he doesn't really have anything like that. He'll always draw attention to the hurly-burly of practice. So hurly-burly means the muddle of our ordinary lives, of the world that we live in. It's out of that muddle that we generate ideas, that we do things together.
So you see more, probably for Tako's question, you see more of the element of this anxiety and concern rather than sense of security at home in Wittgenstein.
Not exactly. I mean, he's not advocating anxiety or something like that. What I tried to say was that the title we have of this course,
No, I'm not saying that he advocates anxiety. When you read the text of Wittgenstein, I think my question is what kind of tone we should hear from Wittgenstein's
okay, well that's a good question, yes. So it's written in a totally different way from the Tractatus. Tractatus is extremely orderly, and it has a kind of hypertext structure with 7 main propositions, each one of which breaks down into smaller arguments. In the philosophical investigations, you've got this string of paragraphs that kind of overlap with one another, sometimes go back. And he says that it's rather like a piece of land with a path across here, then another one across there, then you cross back across there, and many paths intersect, and gradually the picture of the land comes into view. Within the paragraphs, as you saw, and you can see on the screen now, there's very often a dialogue going on. And the dialogue is between another voice, in inverted commas, and then a response that comes to that. And sometimes through dashes and other typographical marks, he will show a third possibility coming in as well. So very often he's bringing up an idea which seems right, then showing what's wrong with it, and then trying to find some other way through. Sometimes it's resolved, sometimes it's not. And he uses metaphors a lot. He uses metaphors like this. Our theorizing ties our thinking up in knots. K-N-O-T-S. Knots. You know what that means? Yes. Yes, that's right. And sometimes the movements you have to make to undo the knots are more complicated and difficult than the ones that tied them in the first place. If you think of a child tying a knot, horrible mess. Okay? Another metaphor would be that we need to let the fly out of the fly bottle. You know a fly bottle?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Can you explain in Japanese, please?
入り口が狭くて入ったらこう抜けて
Bzz.
The entrance is very narrow and
Irritating noise.
right.
Yes, okay. And another is that we need to give philosophy peace. P-E-A-C-E. We need to give philosophy peace because philosophy has tied itself up in metaphysical confusions. We need to go back to the ordinary world and stop asking these metaphysical questions. But he gives philosophy peace, and then the questions start up again, as though there's a natural tendency in the human being to question its own condition. As though our condition is unheimlich, that we cannot simply be at home in the world because we worry about what home is. So you achieve at homeness, and then you are disturbed. Then you achieve at homeness or peace, and then you're disturbed again. So there's a very strong sense of undulation in the text, as though we cannot, it's not a matter of having a problem and finding a clear solution. It's more to do with the very psychology of the human, that the human is in a relation to reality that is sometimes settled and sometimes disturbed.
Is this the right?
Yes, it means wave. but I'd say uneven waves as well.
こっち行ったかと思うとこっち行くっていう揺れがテキスト自体。
I'm not fully sure about the topic of grammar.
Grammar.
Yeah, but I cannot explain what I didn't understand. But could you give me an explanation again?
Okay, so the first example is just to show you what Wittgenstein is not writing about. So this is the conventional notion of grammar, and this is a grammatical mistake. It should be you were drunk, right? That's not what he means by grammar. What he means is that for us to know what a pencil is, or to know what philosophy is, or to know how to play chess, it depends upon participation in a practice.
Yeah,
Not just an isolated atom of knowledge, but participation in a practice. Even to know what a cup is depends upon knowing that you go to the shop and you buy a cup or pour coffee in it or whatever. So there's a lot of practice that goes into that. Does that help that much?
it's okay.
Yes. Okay, and then the second part, this is more difficult. Grammar opens a part of reality. So the shoe example in Japan is a very good one, I think, that when you come to Japan, you learn that you take your shoes off when you go into a house. When you're a small child in Japan, you learn that you take your shoes off, right? It's part of what happens automatically for you in Japan as you're brought up. But that practice is not an isolated thing, because it partly creates what being at home means in Japan. And it partly creates what being on the inside or in the outside is in Japan. And actually in Japanese culture there are very powerful notions of being inside with others, both in the home and in the community. And I think you have words in Japanese which are very hard to translate about being together with others. Is that right? Can you give examples?
家族だな。家族だな。
I think the count of I think the count of it is also in the America. So,
In America?
so yeah.
What is it in English then? Can you tell us that? You mean apple pie, do you?
Eating apple.
Motherhood and apple pie?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Oh, what is it?
Motherhood and apple pie.
What is the equivalent to 家族団ら in American language?
Like a family get together, but it doesn't convey.
It's not the same.
It conveys like physical proximity, not like the time.
No, but I sometimes feel American
Yeah.
more care about family time than Japanese.
But
Maybe now, but in terms of embedded in the language, because he asked about a term in language,
Yes.
it's embedded. It seems to be embedded there. Go ahead. Taco.
you mentioned the physical proximity. So this is my just subjective impression,
Yeah.
but housing in America is broader than those in Japan. So Japanese people have much more opportunity to be very close to member of family because of the very narrow room.
Yes.
I your point is your point is that? Okay. Or are you saying another dimension?
Well, I was actually just responding very simply to Paul's
Yes, I put it on.
Paul's question, which was, all it was, whether there were particular words
That's right.
that exist because of the way that the social space
Yes.
is considered, or
Mm.
the social reality of
Mm.
Japan, which give birth to different words, or vice versa.
Mm.
Those words give birth to.
Look, kimochi, what about that? Is that relevant? That means kind of cozy, nice, friendliness? Yes. Yes, but comfortable, isn't the sense of comfortable a little bit different in English? That's what I meant. And I thought this kimochi was sitting in a bar with your feet warm under the table, quite close to other people, sharing food, eating off, sharing off the same plate as well. Yes, that's it. Yes, that sort of thing. Yes, yeah. It's not like having a burger, It's not like having a hamburger around the barbecue.
But Americans have barbecue.
I know, but I think it's not the same. It's not so confined physically, and I think there's not the same atmosphere. Of course, it's social in another sense. I don't deny that. But what about factory, company culture? Salaryman, Toyota in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So you go to work for Toyota, and you work there for life, and you have your holidays at the Toyota holiday place, and you show allegiance to Toyota, you gather together in the morning and agree with what you're going to do. You recognize that? Yeah.
Morning meeting.
Yes. Mm.
So the point of that illustration is to show, in response to Yoda's question, that what does grammar,
Yes.
what does it mean that grammar offers a reality?
Yes.
So your point is not that reality exists first.
Yes. Yeah.
There is no fixed reality.
Yeah.
But the
Mm.
grammar, how we live, how we conduct practice, in itself creates reality.
Of course, there is a fixed reality in the sense that there were rocks long before there were people, and the laws of physics pertained long before there were people, and so on. But Wittgenstein's always going to turn back to our ordinary lived experience as what generates the nature of the world, and then to do physics or astronomy or something like that is like a factory estate on the edge of the town. You don't have the factory estate before you have the town. So world in its more fundamental or basic sense is what we're doing now. It's the world we're living in ordinarily, drinking coffee or taking your shoes off and all those other things. So part of the reality of home in Japan is the taking off of shoes. And the division it creates between inside and outside, between belonging and not belonging, is a very powerful one. That seems to me to be replicated in Toyota in a different aspect of human life. Are you in the company? Are you proud of the company? Are you wearing the uniform? Are you... and so on. And that's far stronger in Japan than generally in the West, I think. Does that make sense then?
Your example of hot pot?
Yes.
Well, hot pot was
Nabe.
was very helpful for me to understand
Okay.
your grammar. Thank you.
Okay. If you want to say something in Japanese, please say it, because I'm sure some of it's difficult to describe.
In my opinion, the word wa
Wow.
kanji wa means this contents. Wa another sense meaning is
So watashi wa? No. Okay, right.
or wa can read as a verb nagomu. that kanji can read nagomu. Nagomu means comfortable kimochi.
Yes, okay.
And wa means Japan.
Okay, all right. Okay.
That's interesting.
Okay, thank you.
What means Japan?
和食とか
Yes.
和食とか Yeah, this is a very interesting example of Heiwa, so peace, Washoku, Japan. And then there's very famous people, American writers, who write about the particular quality of Japanese baseball. They say you've got to have wa.
英和辞典とかはもう
English, Japanese.
Japanese dictionary what
Okay.
So wa sometimes, but their point is that wa sometimes exchangeably used as Japan.
Yeah, okay, that's very powerful. Thank you. Okay, and you couldn't have this without lots of practices, lots of things you do. So it's the practices are the grammar that generates that reality. No, yes.
グラマーを生み出す。グラマーがリアリティを作る。
Okay.
So the practices would include things you say and things you do. Yes? Yeah.
I want to ask you about the relation between practice and language. I'm wondering whether the practice comes first or language first. We can behave without language like baby, but that the practice, I don't know. The baby's behavior makes grammar. And do you think that making a practice or making a culture needs language first?
So the sign is like a tool or a lever. It's like a movement that makes something happen. Human signs are totally different from that. Because if I say cup, and Naka gives me the cup, when I do that, then the context, of course, showed what I wanted and my hand and so on. But the word cup can also refer to the football cup that the players win at the end of the year, the big cup. Or it can refer to the cups we were drinking from the other night. In other words, we can refer to things that are not here. We can say, my cup is overflowing, meaning I've got everything I want, or my cup is empty. So it has a metaphorical force. So the point about the word cup is it opens onto possibilities of association, projection into the future, connection, which the lion's noise does not do. So lion's society stays the same through tens of thousands of years. Human society changes dramatically all the time. Imagine this place 10,000 years ago. None of this was here. Okay? So that, the nature of signs is opening on to further possibilities of referring to what is not here now, of stopping our immediate involvement with things, and creating a mediation via the word that opens culture and it opens the world as well. So Heidegger says that human beings are beings in the world, and that possibility is there through language. He says animals are world poor, they have a very limited world, a habitat, an environment, and stones, rocks, are world-less.
Yeah.
Do you get that pattern then?
Yeah.
So if we tie world to human being and to language, then there's an interesting connection in the Bible. In the Gospel according to St. John, in the second, in the New Testament, the first line is, in the beginning was the Word, logos in the Greek. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that seems to me a very profound idea, because what we have as this thing we're sharing, this world we have, this life we have, is generated in so many ways out of our wording of things, the fact that there are signs. So, signs, of course, are not just words. They're also this and so on, an expression, how we sit, all these things. But the fact that our signs open onto further possibilities than a simple transfer of meaning. They're not just instruments, there's something else that's there. So Derrida says that a sign is unsaturated. So do you know the word? If you have a sponge and you put water into the sponge, what is sponge in Japanese? Okay. Okay, so it gets full of water, then it's saturated, it can contain no more water, right? But a word is always unsaturated. So that if I say revolution, you may think of this, or the Russian Revolution, or the French Revolution, or Che Guevara, or the fact that I mentioned the word earlier on. It's always going to be open to new associations. So when anyone speaks, others in the room understand, but that understanding is also constituted partly by new thought. So I say a word, revolution, and you think something, but you add something different, and you all have slightly different associations and connections. So the word itself is not full up with meaning, it's always open for you to add more. And that's the way it necessarily works. Again, it's this space for new possibility. When the little child hears kitty, the word for baby cat, she makes extra associations. And some of those associations are ones we won't follow. So if she touches a fur rug on the floor, we won't encourage her to say that because it confuses things if she uses the word differently from us. But it's a good thing she's made those associations, because actually that's what we're doing all the time. So we need both to follow a conventional use of the word, but also realize the word opens to new possibilities.
That's a projective.
Yes, that's right, yes. And sometimes those possibilities are manifested in ordinary use. For example, computer mouse is obviously derivative from animal mice, and it's unproblematic, it's convenient to say that. But there's also this more loose opening to association connection that's going on all the time. What did you say? No?
But for example, the baby has a baby word. So like, for example, baby calls dog in Japan wan wan.
Yes.
And in English, bow wow.
Bow wow, yes.
Yes, but both sound reflect the way they
barking.
Barking,
yes.
yeah. And this reflects the physical reaction,
yes.
or physical practice, and through the repetition of such physical practice, the babies learn how to pronounce physically first.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
And so it seems to me the physical practice comes first, and then they learn languages. But to enter languages, there must be the language history of languages into which the baby enters at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm wondering where the language comes from.
Okay. Well, the way you described it, I think separated the mind and the body too clearly, because it's as though you said language is a mental thing, and the body is the baby moving about or the dog barking or something. But language is also physical,
Yeah.
because to have language we must have either marks on the screen
Yeah.
or on paper or sound waves made by the breath.
Yeah.
So there is this physical element, and I mean another word for lingua can also, the root of language,
Yeah.
also means tongue.
Yeah.
And so the separation you made is part of the intellectualization that comes with Descartes and the mind-body separation and so on. So if we bring the two together, I think that helps. Well, you said, where does language come from? And I think the answer is that you can't articulate this.
Yeah.
So you know, the words that you and I are speaking are words that have associations and connections and origins beyond what we can know, which is kind of a bit scary and a bit wonderful as well. That's the very condition for us being able to speak and to think as a human being.
So you're saying that even the apparently physical sound, like wang or bao bao, wouldn't exist without various kind of association and background knowledge and the
Yes.
communication with mother and baby and
Yes,
father and
yeah,
baby.
Sure, yes, yes. Because you know, when the baby says, or small child says, "Wawa," the dog doesn't react. You know, the dog doesn't understand that as a bark. So it's already a human copying. You know, it's a human mimicking of the dog. Dogs can't do that. You know, it's not part of their sign system.
Can I say my opinion from another perspective? Before today's class, I was wondering why philosophers like Wittgenstein so focused on the language game or the language. But I understand from your today's lecture why Wittgenstein focused on language, but even if the roots or foundation may be illusion, but our reason seeks something transcendental. So my question is, can we satisfied with the Wittgenstein's philosophy, or can we satisfied with the therapy by philosophy,
Yes,
language
okay.
philosophy?
Okay. Right. What Wittgenstein's partly reacting to is the way he thought earlier on, which Russell thought as well, which is that ordinary language, the way we're speaking now, is a messy, unreliable thing, and that underneath ordinary language is the possibility of logic. So the logic of utterances is really the foundation of thought. Logic is the foundation. And our thought will be better if we can make our thought into logic. He's partly thinking of formal logic, which is written a little bit like algebra. You understand? Algebra. Okay, so that logic is the foundation of things. So Wittgenstein is strongly anti-foundationalist in this sense, that he doesn't think that logic underlies language. He thinks that logic is something we create out of ordinary language. Logic rides on top of ordinary language. This is why our ordinary speech and interaction is more basic than physics or than logic. They're both wonderful things, and the things we can articulate in physics or logic or mathematics are wonderful things, but they are human practices that depend upon and come out of this much more messy interaction with all its openness and possibilities of newness and so on. Sometimes when people are talking about whether someone is reasoning well, it's as though they have a rigid idea of how logic must be. And they want to pull the student into that rigidity of reasoning. Now, of course, there are some things in logic some rules that you must follow to be reasonable, but there is so much more that good reasoning depends upon. Often, an example of logic is Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. So that's a syllogism, it works logically, but Socrates must be mortal if the first premise and the second premise are true. Have you heard that before? Yes, okay. But the problem is that shows us the validity of the argument. What it doesn't deal with is whether the premises we start with are true or not. So if I said Socrates is a cat, all cats sing the blues, therefore Socrates sings the blues, that's also a valid argument, even though the first and second sentences weren't true. So often what matters in good reasoning in the real world is that we have true premises. We come to see the world truly. And that depends upon much more than the rigidity of logic.